Before we get into today's episode, we just want to remind you, if you haven't yet, please join us on Patreon. Just go to Patreon and search for So Much Crime, So Little Time, or go to patreon.com/so much crime, so little time, and help support the show. We'll also give you access to early info about what's coming up, what we're going to cover, clips from the show that hasn't come out yet, some bonus clips, stuff that doesn't get released to the general public, and maybe we'll even send you some swag. So please join us on Patreon.
And don't forget to tell your friends, rate us on Spotify, get the word out. So Much Crime, So Little Time. Episode 34 is here.
How does a woman get turned into a sex spy by the Russian government?
Here's a hint. It's not with positive affirmation and providing safe spaces to learn.
It's time to recap To Die For on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Dee. And before we start, warning, there will be spoilers in this episode. We're talking about all of the podcasts To Die For.
If you haven't listened yet, check out our preview episode of the show. It's the one before this one in your feed. You'll also find a link for To Die For in our show notes.
As a reminder, To Die For came out in March of 2024.
There are 8 total episodes. Each is about 30 minutes long, and the host is Neil Strauss.
In our preview episode, we introduce the story. Basically, our host gets the chance to interview this alleged former sex spy from Russia.
And over the course of the show, we learn about how she ended up there and what her training was like. All right, that's enough of a summary. Dee, let's jump in. Let's discuss all of To Die For.
Do we have to?
Is that your...
Can we just leave it there?
All right, let's unpack that a little.
Okay.
How do you feel? How do you feel about this? I mean, I get the gist of how you feel about it.
I'm annoyed. I feel like it kind of leads you to believe that this is 8 episodes of a complete story.
Yeah.
And spoiler, you get to the end of episode 8 and nothing has happened. You're in the middle of a story.
I would say the story, you're still in the prologue of a story, really.
It's so surface level.
Yeah.
In a way, or beneath the surface somewhat, but not too much, only for dramatic effect, salacious effect. I don't know. It was weird. I have a bizarre comparison here.
Okay.
It's like the whole thing here is that Aliia was taught how to seduce men to gain information or so they could bribe her or whatever. This is the whole plot. And it's like Neil Strauss and the whole production team are like, let's seduce the listeners into listening to binge on 8 episodes and want more, but don't give them enough. Just give them enough that they might want more, but don't give them enough that it is anything of substance.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's like telling you how the magic tricks works while still doing the magic trick on you. Like it's frustrating. It's definitely frustrating. And I mean, just to be clear, what we're talking about is basically we went through 8 whole episodes. Like we went through the first episode and based on, all right, I think we know what the story is going to be. It's going to be about this woman who becomes a spy for the Russian government. She somehow ends up in the U.S. where she wants to kind of spill her secrets. It's a very big deal that she is sharing all this and she's putting herself and people around her at risk. Like that, the stakes seemed high. And then really by the end of episode 8, all we've heard about is 1 year in her life in school, basically training. And a lot happens in that year. It's pretty dramatic and traumatic. Like it's harrowing, but it's not the story that I feel like we were told we were going to get.
Yeah. They sold it as if the whole like premise of the podcast was made out to be digging deep into what governments do, what the Russian government does, but it does allude to it, actually says it outright that like this happens in so many other countries. In the UK, it happens with the US, like there's this whole thing. But that's it, like that's all you get. There's nothing else.
Yeah.
And then there's this one time, there's a lot of Aliia saying, oh, this one time, this happened with this important person. but that's it. It's all surface level. It felt like a bad James Bond movie.
Yeah.
Like it's all this surface level stuff. There's nothing in depth. And like I don't mean to take away from her trauma. If we take this story as complete fact that we are listening to, the story of what she says is her life, and we're taking that as fact. There's so much I can't understand how there's so much trauma there, but we're not getting anything. Like we're not getting anything other than this thing happened over and over again.
Right. Yeah. I mean, basically, she's in an abusive environment where she gets
Constantly.
yeah, where
Since she was a child.
right. Although we really don't get much of her life as a child. We get a little bit of, I think, one episode which kind of goes into her background with her father and kind of how she was raised. But really, the vast majority of what we get covers this short period of time where she's basically training, and I don't even feel like we get enough of that. Like I feel like that is also very surface level of like, I don't know, there's so much to be said for how someone becomes a spy. What not just a sex spy, but like a spy in general, right? Like she is trained on how to get secrets, on how to kill people, like all this stuff that seems like it would make a pretty fascinating story.
Yeah, but we don't hear about that. We hear about the salacious stuff. We hear about the the props that are brought to her class and how she is taught how to provide pleasure to the person that she is trying to seduce. We hear in depth and like in too much detail. I don't need to know that. Like I don't need to know what the prop was and how exactly you were taught to do whatever to it. It's not something that is giving anything to the story. And it's hard to know, is she telling it this way? Or is this the editing that is keeping in, the good bits? And for the listeners, because nobody can see me, I'm air quoting here, like the good bits, the bits that maybe the listeners might be interested in. It just, do you know what pissed me off?
What? Tell me what pissed you off. We haven't figured that out yet.
It feels like they're taking advantage of Aliia.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if we remember, she was a child when she was assaulted for the first time. She was not 18 when she was assaulted for the first time. Even looking at her relationship with her dad, she was so vulnerable, and I think he was trying to do so much good, and yet I feel like it really has created a lot of damage in her life. But it felt like instead of telling her story in a respectful and like journalistic manner, they took advantage of her vulnerability, and they produced it in a way to ensure she came across as a seductress, not a person, not a victim, but as someone who seduces people. And that was played again and again, Jeff, even with at the end of a traumatic story or episode within her life that she's talking about. He says, Neil Strauss is like, oh, and I wonder, was it a good idea for her to be in my apartment telling me this story?
Yeah.
Like, what?
Why do we need to know that?
You're actually playing into the narrative that she's not believable.
Yeah.
Yourself by saying that, because she's not trustworthy, because she previously has seduced men. It's all playing into this narrative that she is not trustworthy.
I mean, we talked about this a little in the previous episode, but I'm trying to remember the last time, if there ever was a last time, where we heard an interviewer talking about inviting someone who's potentially a murderer or whatever, someone who is dangerous in a way into their home where their child is. And yeah, so that came up in episode 1, and then it's the end of episode 5. I wrote it down because this is after he just gets into where she describes all the like vulnerable parts of a man and how to attack it with her heels, with her nails, like, and then he's like, maybe I shouldn't have her over at my house. And it's sort of like with that like wink, wink, like, hey, this sexy spy lady is at my house, and isn't that awesome? And how cool am I? Like that's the vibe I get.
So gross.
Yeah,
it is the vibe. And what's worse is in that episode as well, he basically talks about how he alludes to different tactics that the Russian government might use when trying to get, say, a government agent on side from a different country, a foreign government agent on side, such as a woman is coming on to the man, and as they're walking back to her hotel room or his hotel room, she kisses him but then rips her clothes and claims rape, and he's brought in by the police, and this is the whole like scheme basically
Right.
to get this person on side. But what he says then is this is so dangerous for sexual assault victims who are not believed. Like, it's playing into the fact that they shouldn't be believed. So he's saying it. And I feel like throughout the series, he did mention a couple of times how, you know, Aliia was a victim and we need to be respectful of sexual assault victims. And it's kind of said throughout. But to me, it came across that it was being said to tick the box. It's like how in every episode here, I got to tick the box and tell you you're much older than me. It's just what has to happen. And it felt there like it was a tick the box exercise. It was absolutely, there was actually no empathy or real care about that.
I both agree and see what you just did there. Yeah. Nicely done.
2 birds, 1 scone.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the bigger picture issue is just sort of the grand tease of it all, right? Like the lack of any sort of resolution to the story, or even the story that I feel like we thought we were going to get in a really kind of frustrating way. But then there's all these little details that sort of add up. And I think to sort of pile on to what you've been saying, there are so many potentially interesting elements and some things that are mentioned sort of in passing that I think are fascinating. Like, I think the thing I was just talking about, where she goes through the discussion of, you know, these are the ways that a woman without a weapon can attack a man successfully. Like, that's interesting. And the part before that, where she talks about how when you're potentially going to murder someone, you know, what are the things you have to think about in advance, like not going too heavy on the makeup because you don't want to leave a trace of makeup on the man. No perfume because scent sticks around. No earrings because particularly the types of earrings that might accidentally fall out or be left behind, right? Like, just kind of those things that I certainly never would have thought of that are interesting,
No.
right? Like that is sprinkled throughout, but it's so kind of sparse throughout the whole
It
series.
is sparse. Yeah, like what I found interesting, I think it was episode 6, Dancing with the Devil. There was this kind of whole play into anchoring and how you anchor someone and how you kind of connect happiness with them, bridge the gap between happiness or pleasure between them and a certain thought that they might have.
Yeah.
So this whole thing about massaging and talking about, you know, things that make you feel good, all this accomplishment and how that'll build a relationship between people. I found that really interesting. I found that kind of fascinating. Not something I ever thought of before. And it was so interesting until it gets too kind of explicit. I'm just like, you're kind of going down a genre of like erotica or something with some of it. And it just seemed unnecessary.
But it's
like, I'm no prude. But don't put it in front of me as if it's adding anything to the story. It's not. And really what pisses me off as well, pisses me off a lot, what pisses me off is it's making light of the fact that she has been sexually assaulted numerous times, and she's also more or less coerced into assaulting other people. But it's created as if it's this like whole sexy thing. Like, it's not.
No, it's pretty ugly. It's
awful. I felt like it would be akin to a podcast going into the real depths of a gruesome murder or attack, like vicious details that just don't serve a purpose. You can say a lot with fewer words. And I think if 80%, I don't know, of the explicit comments throughout these episodes were taken out, we still would be in the same place.
Yeah.
It doesn't add anything to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it might have actually been more powerful.
I think that's true. Yeah, because it's sort of it has this like unnecessary salaciousness to it, inappropriate salaciousness to it. That yeah, it's both too much and not enough all throughout.
Yeah.
I also
I
can I ask too? So that episode you're talking about, episode 6, where she's talking about the anchoring. She's also talking about like the dynamic she's in. There's this colonel, so this high ranking colonel who, the moment she meets him, he assaults her. But then she decides
Mhm.
that she needs to enter into this relationship with him, this abusive, like horrible power dynamic relationship, because that is her way of basically not getting raped by every man who's there, effectively.
Yeah.
Like that's the short of it. And
Mhm.
but he is also in a relationship with the major who is her teacher. And so there's also a terrible power dynamic there. And it seems like, to me, from what we've gleaned from this, that everybody, all the men, at least, in a position of power in this facility are taking advantage of that power with these women that they are training to be sex spies. Where, like, how do they not see that this is going to all come back to bite them in the ass? Like, how,
Yeah.
what,
I don't know. And that plays in again, doesn't it, to like the credibility of the story? Like, would a colonel with so much information, like so much information on the training that she's going through, would he fall for it?
I mean, we fell for
Like,
listening to this
even
whole
him being in
podcast.
the
So, what,
relationship with, well, I mean, like, would he? Like, seriously.
or is he actually a triple agent? And is, like, what, how many layers do you want to go with this?
Like, would he really fall for it? And also, this early on, like, we're talking about are we a year into her training?
Yeah, all
Like, is
right.
she an A+ student at this?
You're in,
But even, actually, even to be honest, him being in the relationship with the major or whatever she was, who was actually teaching the class, y-
why?
you're getting into a relationship with someone who's really good at seducing men, knowing that she's really good at seducing men. This seems bizarre to me.
Okay. I'm trying to envision the other side of this argument, just for the sake of being a devil's advocate.
Go for it.
I mean, I guess, and I don't know if this happens in real life, but I feel like this happens in stories. Like men fall for prostitutes or strippers, and it's like, they're just trying to get your money, right? Like it's just a job to them, but you think that there's love there, and why? Like where does that come from? Like it's a desperate sort of loneliness and just want to form a human connection.
I don't know. I feel like part of me feels like the whole podcast is made out, and maybe it's true to life, but every avenue that could possibly show the horrendous misogynistic, like the worst case of misogyny is really shown here.
Yeah.
And that kind of makes me feel like surely this can't be 100% true. Maybe I'm naive, Jeff. I don't know, but like everything from like the very everything about it just feels.
Feels what?
My own train of thought that I'm not finishing is leading me on to my follow-up question, which I know I didn't finish my first train of thought, but bear with me. I have a question for you. We have, in previous episodes or previous podcasts that we've reviewed, have always taken a look on how the host and the producer deal with the victim, and if they deal with the victim in a respectful manner, and how they treat them. I feel like I have kind of a slightly different take on our question here. And tell me now if this is an unfair question to put up there. But Do you feel like Aliia is held to... Do you feel like she's scrutinized enough within the first 8 episodes? Do you feel like her story, not her story is scrutinized enough? Do you feel like we hear about what checks went in? We heard in the first episode how they all met in a bar and one of his mates who used to be in the FBI said, "Yeah, she seems credible." And like, is that it? Is that all? Is that all we're doing here?
It does. Yeah.
I'm sure they must have done more in terms of like making sure that this is a credible story. But it feels like we're not seeing that.
Yeah, we don't have
I don't know.
the journalism isn't on display here, right? Like in Blind Plea, Liz Flock talked about all the emails she read through the court transcripts, all the interviews she did, and like that was clearly exhaustive research. Here we get a couple of very kind of broy bros sitting around, kind of smitten with this hot spy, and being like, "Well, checks out." Yeah.
Checks out. Do you want to come over to my place and talk about this over a bottle of wine?
The bottle of wine. Yeah, of course, the bottle of wine. I forgot about that.
It just all feels wrong.
I don't think Liz Flock would invite anybody over for a bottle of wine that she was trying to interview. I think she's a little bit more professional than that.
I mean, I just don't. I just have a lot of questions. Like, I'm leaving on episode 8 with so many questions, and not necessarily, oh my goodness, where is this going? Which I feel like is what they were going for with releasing 8 episodes out, claiming it's a full series and it's not, and then having their volume 2 out with another 10 episodes.
Yeah, if I can,
it's as I said before, it's like a Netflix documentary or a Netflix show that they're like throwing out there, and they just want you to get hooked, like they did with Bridgerton. They sent out like 5 episodes of Bridgerton or something this season, got everyone hooked, and then everyone's talking about the last like 4 or whatever that are going to come out. I love Bridgerton, by the way.
I have nothing to say to that reference, but
okay,
that's
because you've never watched it though. You can't judge it until you look at it. But anyway, what are you talking about?
I do want to point back to a message that I sent you as literally the second I finished listening to episode 8, and I quote, "What the fuck? To Die For ends in the middle of the story. Spoilers, as in there are no spoilers because it doesn't have an ending." Okay, so yeah, you just said how you felt at the end of it, like you don't really want to go on. Like you felt like they presume that you want to go on to volume 2, which we don't even hear about volume 2 until the end of volume 1, that there is a volume 2. And I can't spoil anything for you. I can't spoil the ending because I knew you hadn't finished listening to it yet because there's nothing to spoil. It doesn't go anywhere. On top of that, let me throw in something else too. When I'm talking about some of the little bits of things that are sprinkled in that are really interesting. So in episode 4, Pandora's Box, there was a reference to Gabrielle Klein. And so she was someone who was in a relationship with a male sex spy, a Raven or Romeo, as they are called, for 7 years. 7 years. There's also a bit about Clayton Lonetree.
Mm-hmm. Can we go back to the credibility?
Yes.
Like, the other thing that annoyed me about the credibility is, sorry, I did listen to what you had to say.
Do you have a list? Like, do you have like a these things I hate about this?
I have so few notes on this podcast. Most of what I heard, I could not write down, Jeff.
Because it was too vulgar?
Like, it's just so unnecessary. I just hated it. So one thing that annoyed me was, I think it was in episodes. Another thing that annoyed me. I think it was in episode 7, but I have it down in my notes in episode 8. So take that as you will. It doesn't matter. It's all the fucking same. She says, if my father finds out, and she's alluding to her being a sex spy, it would probably kill him.
Mm-hmm.
But she's doing a podcast.
Yeah.
I don't understand this.
Yeah.
She has a social media presence. I don't understand this.
She's on a billboard.
If my father finds, like, if my father finds out, it would probably kill him, and then you just keep going and doing it? What? this is another reason I'm like, I'm sorry.
Well, that speaks to,
I'm
I think,
sorry, but
I feel,
I don't know.
I think part of my frustration there is, so there's the credibility issue. Like, is she investigated? Do we feel like they did their due diligence in verifying that she is who she says she is, that what happened to her really happened? If not, what a horrific story to make up. If elements of this are untrue, then we've just been sort of led astray. And like, there's so many unanswered questions, but it just like, it doesn't hold together in the end. Like, to that
It
point,
doesn't. And
like to your point about the thing about her father, well, there's no resolution to that. Like, there's no resolution to, like, her father either finds out about this or he doesn't find out about this. But if they're releasing this in volumes over the course of like 2024 or the next couple of years, however long they're going to drag this out, like at some point we're going to get to the point where he theoretically hears about this because it's a podcast all over the internet.
or the Russians hear about it and kill her because she was a former sex spy and she's releasing all their secrets.
Yeah, it's not like the Russians are going to stop going after people, right? Like,
I, I just, it just, and do you know what? I need it. It's not really on her because whoever she is, whether she's telling the truth or not, the only reason I'm questioning her really is because of how this has been produced.
yeah, yeah,
It's not because it if she is speaking and she is speaking her truth, I feel like it is being produced as if it is false. I don't think they are helping in their production to ensure that her story is backed up. Even at the start, it was like, we're going to allow her to speak in her rawest
I
form
was just going to bring
and
that up.
allow her
Yeah,
to take it on. And I'm like, are you A, taking away any responsibility from yourself? Or are you, by not interjecting, you're not questioning. By not questioning, you're not getting further than surface level. Like, even as someone who lives through something, you need to be questioned to kind of consider things from different angles. We've seen that in so many podcasts where interviews happen and people are interviewed about really sensitive topics and they kind of have to pause and like think about the question they're being asked and really have to dive and kind of figure out their way through it. But we don't get that because she doesn't get questioned.
yeah. I want to talk about.
She's just
Yeah,
there speaking out about it.
I wanted to talk about
but it
that.
doesn't feel genuine. Sorry.
If I can get a word in, can I?
Me? Am I talking too much? That doesn't sound like me at all.
So, two things. You're talking about at the beginning of episode 2, where Neil basically says that he's going to he's not going to interrupt her. He's just going to let her tell her story. And yeah, that was my first note from that episode, which is basically me writing sarcastically, Neil is so great to give her space to talk. And that he also mentions how he did this like trauma informed interviewing training. And we're going to hear, like, basically he's going to give her space. To me, the subtext of this was he's going to do this for her even though she's a woman. Like, there was like a misogyny inherent in his tone that
I think that's coming from what you've read about him and like you went in there with prejudice. I didn't get that.
maybe. But the other thing that relates to this is in episode 6, where he begins that episode talking about how he had to basically delay an interview session with her because she had a therapy session that went 7.5 hours. First of all, 7.5 hour therapy session.
Followed by an interview.
Yeah, then she goes and does an interview with him. But then he interviews the therapist. And he talks about how he got permission to interview the therapist. But I feel like that's also treating her not as like a full human being. Like, she has no agency here, right? Like, he is taking advantage of her in multiple ways. Like, I don't, like, even if he got permission from her, from the therapist to talk about this, I just don't think that's an appropriate thing to include. Like, talking about the therapy that she was going through, the trauma she's still trying to process in this sort of flippant way, where also, again, I feel like it's sort of checking a box saying like, no, we're okay. Because she signed off on this. It doesn't, like, it just doesn't seem like he did that training that he says he did at the beginning.
It's as if he's lacking some integrity here. even from a like, I'm going back to the apartment with a bottle of wine and the two of them chatting. If it's just so unprofessional. If someone has gone through so much sexual assault, why, as the interviewer, who is going to have the one up on the power dynamic because you know what you want to get from the interview and you can steer an interview, says me, who's interviewed two people in her life, presumably someone who's good at and has interviewed a lot of people, they're able to kind of steer things or try to steer conversations in a certain way. So the power really is with the interviewer in terms of the questions they put forward.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to take away the power by bringing someone into your apartment and
Where we see throughout the story what happened to her when she was brought into these situations with men, right? Where she was on unfamiliar ground and the men had power over her. Terrible things happened to her again and again.
And I just want to be clear, I'm not blaming her for doing that, for going to the interview. I'm not blaming her even for how this story has been told. I have some questions that I think anyone would ask in terms of scrutinizing the story, just from, as you said, a form of due diligence. But I just feel like he has failed here and the production team have failed here to really protect her.
Yeah.
As basically their story. She is their entire story.
She is the entire story. Let me ask you a question about that. Do you think, like, if you were producing this, would you have, let me ask this as a two-parter. Do you think it's appropriate to have a man interview her? And especially a man whose biggest claim to fame is writing a book about seducing women.
I mean, you never know how the negotiations came to this point. She said she sought him out.
Yeah.
And he was the one that she wanted. So to be fair,
Sure.
Do I think it's right? No, I don't. Is she trying to go head to head with someone he claims he could basically seduce anyone? Maybe.
Get a fucking
like
office
a seduce
somewhere.
Off.
Go to WeWork or something. Go.
I feel like you didn't give my joke enough.
What was your joke? I missed your joke.
Anyway.
I talked over it.
Like a seduce off.
A seduce off. You're really proud of that.
I was really proud of it. I'm such I love my dad jokes.
No, like there should be a
get an office, a team,
a mediator,
a third party,
a witness.
Not your son.
Not your son. Not your daughter either. Not a child.
Not your son.
Yeah.
Not your daughter. No.
Not your dog. Not your cat. Not your fish. Yeah.
No.
None of those are acceptable. And maybe lose the wine.
So, I mean, that's the other thing. Like, wine just makes you talk too much. Don't have that before an interview.
She said as she sipped tequila.
I was not sipping tequila as that happened. Jeff, I have a question. I just don't know which side of the fence you're going to go to. Would you recommend this to a friend?
I'm trying to think of the friend that I would recommend this to.
Oh my God, I had another question for you.
Okay.
When you were listening to her, her description of, how she learned to seduce people and what do they call it? Nagging?
Nagging.
And anchoring and all this. Especially obviously in the way that people speak, not necessarily, and maybe the way they dress, but not necessarily further than that. Did anyone you've ever met come to mind?
Wow. That's
I have.
sounds like a dish for you.
There's two people who I have been around in the last, say, 5 or 10 years who came to mind when this was going on, when I was listening to this, and I was like, oh my God, did they read a book on this? This is so funny. In a funny way, not in a I'm seducing you for national security. And not that they were seducing me, but I more mean sorry, I'm not doing well at explaining this. More when people are like charming, so charming that they can get information out of you, or they can get, I'm not talking about actually being seduced by them.
No,
But I suppose it is a form of seduction if someone's able to do that.
well, it's the same thing as like the what is it, the how to win friends and influence people, right? Like it's kind of
Mm,
learning the art of interpersonal dynamics and how to sort of I mean, the negative side is like take advantage of people, but the positive side is sort of how to ingratiate yourself with people, like how to make friends too, right? Like
yeah.
how to function in a conversation with strangers. Do you want to name names of those people? Like, do you want to call them out here?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Names, Instagram
Okay.
handles,
We can
phone
tag them on
numbers.
Instagram when this episode comes out.
But did anyone come to mind for you? Is what I was wondering.
I don't think so. Sometimes when I listen to things like this, it sort of reminds me of how often I am around people who aren't good at this, or who are who are socially awkward, or which I feel like speaks about most people in the world who are just trying to make it through their day and aren't like
Mm,
comfortable enough in their own skin, let alone trying to whether it's take advantage or just like use these tricks on people around them, right? Like I feel like a lot of people are, and it can be the spectrum from being too lacking self-confidence or being self-conscious to being self-absorbed on the other end of the spectrum. That it's a particular type of person who uses tactics like this just in everyday life, I think.
yeah,
Anyway,
indeed.
would you recommend this podcast to anyone?
Only those few friends I mentioned who should listen to how bad their acts are. No, I wouldn't.
Okay. Do you
Uh-uh.
do you to what extent do you regret listening to this?
Oh, I find that hard. I'm a bit of an Egypt when it comes to regrets. I'm like, do you really have to regret something? Like, I don't regret listening to it. We got to take the good with the bad. It just shows the journalistic integrity of someone, other people that we've met throughout this. It shows the power of good production in podcasts. I think it gives, a real low bar to go up from here.
So we've talked about it in terms of the story, but just kind of overall, just generally speaking, this is a place to kind of wrap this up. But like when you think about how you felt at the end of the preview, right? Like our preview of episode 1 and how you felt having listened to the whole thing. We often talk about,
I was a little bit into it. I was like, I'm a little bit seduced. They did it. They got me.
yeah,
I'm like ready to go with the story. And then I felt like I listened to 7 more episodes of the same thing over and over again. To be honest, I really don't think I got much more out of it.
yeah,
Couple of things: anchoring, Romeo's.
yeah. No, I hear you.
I don't know.
It's kind of like if you
I
go
didn't
to
think there was enough substance.
the movies and you get those trailers before the movie and it's kind of all flash and tease and lack substance. And then before your movie starts, you just go home.
That's it. They just like cut it after the trailers and was like, that's it for tonight, folks.
Yeah.
Don't forget to clean up your popcorn on the way out. We're going to win next time, Jeff. We're going to get one that is good. We got this.
I hope so. I believe in us.
Me too. Thank you so much for listening today. Don't forget, as Jeff mentioned at the start of this episode, to join our Patreon. You'll get early access to future shows, bonus content, and really help us to support making the show. So it's patreon.com/so much crime, so little time.
And if you enjoyed listening to this show and all of our other episodes, please remember to rate us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate it.
Next time, we're going to the north of England.
It's the height of lockdown when a 19-year-old claims on social media that she's been trafficked by an Asian grooming gang.
The photos of her horrific injuries add to the outrage, and the post goes viral, shared more than 100,000 times.
That leads to attacks on Asian men and businesses in her hometown.
But then she's arrested for possibly making the whole thing up.
We're going to preview the Sky News podcast Unreliable Witness, which is season 6 of Storycast.
That's next on So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MimeGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Calariso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.